So hi everyone from Vietnam, and I hope that you have enjoyed the conference so far. So I welcome you on to our next plenary session of today. So hi everyone, so my name is Khan Bui. I'm the moderator of this session, and this is my colleagues.
Hello, my name is Tâm Nguyễn. I'm also the moderator of these sessions.
And our speaker today. Yeah, Dr. Julie Central. So it's our pleasure to welcome you on to the plenary session of VIC 2020. The title of this session is Reimagining English as an Additional Language Implication in the Online Global Classroom. So presented by Dr. Julie Central. Now I will hand it over to Trump to introduce our keynote speaker today.
So good morning, everyone. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Julie Ciancio. She has published numerous articles, conducted professional development workshops and teacher training workshops on TESOL, entrepreneurship, soft skills, and international education around the world. Currently, she's the Dean of the College of Education and also the Dean of International Development at Westwood University in Irvine, California, where she oversees the intensive English, general education, the Bachelor's in Education, MA TESOL, and TESOL certificate programs, as well as the development of the new programs, such as the Ed Education and the Teacher Credential programs in the college. Moreover, she is primarily responsible for the internationalizations of the institutions by setting up transnational educational opportunities through affiliate institutions, international collaborations, student mobility articulation agreements, university corporate associations, faculty and student exchange programs, joint research opportunities, joint and dual degrees, inbound and outbound study abroad opportunities, summer camps, as well as short-term customized programs. So she's everything. So let's give it up to Dr. Julia Ciancio and welcome her to the speech today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tram, and thank you, Khan, for such a warm welcome, and thank you for such a kind introduction. It's truly my pleasure to be here. I'm very excited to have this honor to be able to present at the VietTESOL conference. I missed the US TESOL conference this year because most unfortunately it was canceled due to COVID. I had a pre-conference workshop I was going to give, so I'm really excited to be able to connect with the VietTESOL community. So thank you so much for your kind invitation and your warm welcome. Well, today I'm going to be talking about reimagining English as an additional language, implications in the online global classroom, because all of us have had to suddenly transfer to online teaching if we weren't already doing it. Now we're doing it in a massive way where everybody has suddenly been pushed into online. So I'd like to talk a little bit today about, there we go. Okay, so this is my agenda for the day. I'm going for this talk for the next 50 minutes or so. I'm going to talk a little bit about English as an additional language and what that is, and a little bit about the flipped classroom model. And then we'll get into some strategies that we'll use for advanced teaching, for conversation activities that we can use either on ground or in the online environment. So are you familiar with the term English as an additional language? Do you know what that refers to? Is this a common term in Vietnam? In the US, we still use ESL and EFL very commonly. The term EAL is more used in the UK, in the British context, and perhaps in some countries that were influenced by the Brits. So in the US, we still kind of think of the dichotomy of English as a foreign language or English as an additional language. And I personally really like this concept of English as an additional language because we think of the English language learners their home language and their home culture as tools that they use in the acquisition of English. So we don't make the assumption that it's their second language. Maybe they know 3 or 4 other languages. And so English is an additional language. We don't want to be so presumptuous as to think that it's their second language. And we look at their other languages as tools that they can use for acquiring English language. And so it's important for us as English language teachers to recognize the linguistic and the cultural background of our students and to honor that and to use that as a tool for learning language. And it's also very nice because it acknowledges diversity and the fact that our students may come from various backgrounds, different socioeconomic status. Some people come from the country, some people come from the city, some people come from up north or down south. And so they have very different backgrounds that they bring to the classroom that we can use as a tool to share and communicate and build community. So I would like to kind of keep that concept in mind as we talk about these strategies to use in online teaching. So let me pose a question to the audience, and perhaps you can participate in the chat and have a little conversation going on while I'm talking. I would like to ask you, how can you actively engage language learners in an online synchronous class? At Westcliff University, where I'm the dean, we use synchronous classes. It's not very common, but for most universities in the US at least, typically professors will choose whether they want to have live online sessions or if they will just teach asynchronously. Asynchronous is kind of self-paced and students do the reading on their own. Maybe they'll answer some discussion questions in a forum and they submit their assignments online and receive feedback, but they really don't get an opportunity to interact and engage with their classmates or to see their professors one-on-one and see their face. And there's a lot of research that shows that we connect much better when we can actually see people's faces. And with English as an additional language, we're thinking about that human connection between people and language. So the synchronous classroom is a great opportunity for us to be able to delve deeper into that diversity and human aspect of English as an additional language. So I'm going to talk about some dynamics or strategies or activities that we can use in an online synchronous class, but of course we can always adapt these activities for on-ground teaching. And perhaps we can think about how we might also use them in an asynchronous class. So maybe you can kind of have that dialogue in the background as we continue our talk here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the flipped classroom model. And I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this, but it's kind of important to mention for these activities that I want to discuss. In the traditional model, typically students come to class and they'll sit passively in their seats and they'll listen to a lecture and sometimes just leave, and they don't get an opportunity to interact with their classmates or interact with their teacher. So nowadays with technology, there's no reason for people to get in traffic and commute and need to go to a classroom to go and sit there in isolation in their chair and listen to a lecture. We can easily do that from the comfort of our own homes by watching videos. We can look at SlideShare and PowerPoint, and we can read chapters. So we can, in effect, educate ourselves. We can introduce ourselves to a topic. And when we're looking at syllabus development or curriculum development, we often talk about the 3 stages, IDM, introduce, develop, and master content. So in the traditional model, students would come to class for the teacher to introduce them to the topic. In the flipped classroom model, we expect students to introduce themselves to the topic. Now, of course, we don't expect them to entirely teach themselves everything. Let's take advantage of the classroom when they come to class. Then when students have already done some reading and maybe watched some videos, then they can come to class and be prepared and ready to develop and master the concepts that we're trying to teach. So we take Bloom's taxonomy and kind of tip it on its head. So in the traditional classroom, we're looking at the lower order thinking skills. And in the flipped classroom model, we're looking more at the higher order thinking skills, the HOTS, when students come to class. So this is when we get them to do interactive activities where they need to analyze or critique, summarize, develop, create, some of the more advanced types of thinking is what we will be able to do more effectively in a flipped classroom model if students have already exposed themselves to the content before they came to class. So let me ask you another question. What group discussion strategies have you used to foster active learning while developing speaking skills in your synchronous online class? And if you don't teach in a synchronous class, you can talk about what you do in your on-ground class or in your asynchronous class. But how do you get students engaged? How do you get them to be active participants in their own knowledge acquisition? Because ultimately, we as the teacher, we can't really teach anybody anything. We can facilitate, we can guide, we can answer questions, we can give direction, we can give examples, we can elucidate, but it really is up to the learner to want to acquire the information. So how do we keep them active and engaged so that they're motivated and interested in the content and they really want to learn and they come to class ready to participate? So I have a few activities that we'll discuss and go over, and I'll talk about these strategies and how we can use them on ground or online in a synchronous classroom. And then at the end, we'll open it up for Q&A. So if we have some questions that you would like to discuss about how you might implement these strategies in your classroom, we can talk about that. So please send your questions in the chat. So the first activity that I'd like to talk about is affinity mapping. And affinity, what does affinity mean? Affinity means same or similar or likeness. Like we can use the word, when you have an affinity for something, it means that you like it because it's somewhat similar to something that you already know or identify with. So affinity mapping is a type of brainstorming activity where you get students to put all of their ideas on. So let's say, for example, if we were to teach this in the classroom, they would put all of their ideas on the whiteboard, and you can give students a marker and they can just write down one-word ideas. You give them a broad topic to talk about and just get them to brainstorm and generate ideas. Or you can give them sticky notes and have them use sticky notes to put their ideas on the board. And we can also do this in a synchronous class by having students collaborate on a Google Doc. So if you open a Google Doc and share it with the participants in your class and ask them to brainstorm about a topic or an idea, then you can have students work in groups to try and organize these ideas into categories. So if you're doing this in the classroom, you might have them sit at their tables and rearrange the stickies onto a chart where they can put them into categories. And if you're doing it online, you might have them rearrange the words in the Google Doc and put them into columns, for example. Or if you're doing it, you might also use some tech tools that we have. So I'd like to suggest the affinity mapping could be well done on Flippity, if you've heard of that. It's a really nice website. It's a little bit of a challenging tech tool to use. So I suggest that you practice and play with it before you use it in the classroom. As I would suggest with any tech tool, you really want to be comfortable with it before you use it in the classroom. But this is a great way that students can share ideas and move their ideas around in space, so it's not just static. So you get students to brainstorm. Let's say we're going to talk about, for example, the current situation with moving all of the teaching online. And what are your some concerns or considerations that you have about teaching online? So let's say these are the ideas that student teachers or teachers might put in their brainstorming activity. So then you can put the students or the teachers into groups and have them organize the ideas. So let's say, for example, they organize them into these 4 different categories. We have professional development. So we have ideas like support, reflection, time. Now, of course, this is all subjective where you put the different ideas. So you can get some really good conversation out of participants in an activity like this because they need to negotiate. No, I think it goes here because it goes more with the ideas in this topic. Oh, I disagree. I think it goes better here. Well, let's create a new category. Let's create a category of technology. So there's a lot of negotiation that goes on. So you can see that this is for more advanced levels. With intermediate speakers, you might want to provide them with sentence frames so that they can use those starter words, like I was saying, like, oh, I disagree, maybe it should go here. So you can give them those sentence frames to work with as scaffolding. So that's a brainstorming activity. And then the next dynamic I would like to talk about is an activity that's called conversations. So people converse in different stations in the room. You might have heard of this as talking corners. That's another way of calling this, and it's pretty much the same activity. And there's a lot of different varieties of how you can do this activity. So first of all, you're going to have questions at 4, ideally you would have about 4 different stations in the classroom. Of course, that depends on how many students you have and how much time you have and what topics you would like to cover or what content you would like to cover. So you would develop, let's say, ideally 4 questions, 1 for each of the corners of the room. And you would have groups of about 4 to 6 students. And there would be a question on each table in each of the corners. And students would go to their corner and discuss that question. Then, let's say you have groups of 4. 3 of those students would go to the next table. And the person who stays behind would be responsible for summarizing what his group had discussed before the other 3 moved on. So he needs to synthesize, summarize, and verbalize what his group had discussed, he or she. And then the group will start to generate new ideas. But the new ideas should be different from the previous ideas. So the new group that comes around, you want them to add on ideas to the previous conversation. They already got the summary, so you want them to add on to it. This can also be done in written format. So the group will summarize in writing. It all depends on how much time you have. You might want them to write a paragraph. You might just want them to write bullet points of the main ideas that they discussed before they move on to the next group. But it can be done entirely verbally as well. It doesn't need to be written, but that's another option that you could use. So you keep working in groups like this until everybody has gone around and they have had an opportunity to converse about all of the questions that you have laid out. If the conversation kind of starts to die down because it's hard to add on new ideas after about the 3rd or 4th round because people have thought a lot about that topic, then if you see that the conversation is dying down a little bit, You can have the new participants check ideas that they really like, or they can add an exclamation point to ones that they think are very important, a question mark by ones that they don't understand, or they can circle vocabulary that they don't understand, or key vocabulary that you have asked students to use. So there's a variety of techniques that you can use with this kind of annotation as well. So let's go back to our previous example that we talked about with the affinity mapping. And the students generated ideas in 4 different topics, right? They were looking at technology and professional development and classroom management. So let's develop those into questions that we can use at the conversations. So for example, the first one might be, how can I get professional development for online teaching skills? How can I improve? How can I learn about how to be a better teacher in the online environment? And particularly if we're teaching in a synchronous environment or an asynchronous, you may want to make that distinction. Another question might be, how do I encourage students to be more engaged in classroom lessons, particularly in online classroom? So all of these activities can be used on ground in the classroom or online. So you would change the question a little bit depending on your context or your scenario. How can I transfer my classroom management skills to the online environment? This is really tricky, and this is something that teachers tend to struggle with. We have a line of research that we work on, particularly with this, because what we've noticed is that faculty may be really good in the classroom because they have a lot of classroom management skills that they can use. They can use proximity. They can go up and stand next to a student who's not paying attention, or they can go over to a group and talk to them privately one-on-one if they don't understand. How can we transfer those skills to the online environment? Not everybody who's a good teacher on ground is necessarily qualified to teach online. It can be a bit of a challenge. There's quite a learning curve. It's really quite different. We make the assumption that if you're a good teacher, you're a good teacher. But there's so many other considerations to take into in mind when people are teaching online. Do they have the tech tools? Do they have the background? Do they have the proper planning? Can they multitask? It can be really difficult. So sometimes there's a disconnect when people start to move to the online environment. And then another question might be, how can I use different tech tools for online teaching? So you would have students go around as I described. You would put these 4 questions at the 4 tables around the corners in the room, or you can put them on the walls if you don't want to move furniture around. And as I described, you can have the rotating groups. So it's really nice when you have the one person who stays back to summarize and the other 3 go on. And then the next group that when they go around, so you continually mix the groups. So that keeps the conversation interesting. So you don't have the same 4 people. Although you can do it that way as well, because then you have more team building and the same people get to discuss different topics together and go deeper and deeper as they go around the room. So there's always variety that you can use in these strategies. So lastly, I would like to talk about one other strategy, and this is called the instructional conversation. I use this technique a lot in my on-ground classes. I really like it, particularly for TESOL classes. It's one of my favorites. So it's got a very, very specific dynamic in the way that it's set up. And you really need to follow these rules for setting it up and conducting this activity. Otherwise, it won't be as successful. So the first thing is that you need a prompt. So the prompt is a small paragraph discussion. It's a little scenario that you set up. And there's usually some kind of a dilemma at the end. So some kind of a moral question, or somebody's on the fence about something and they can't decide. So it promotes people to give their opinion. Well, I think she should do this. Oh, I disagree. She shouldn't do that at all. You know, so they get into that kind of conversation. We'll talk more about the prompt in a minute. I'll give you an example and show you how you can develop those. So then you have students sit in a circle. We can call it a fishbowl. So they're sitting inside the fishbowl. They're like in an aquarium where we're going to observe them from the outside. So you have approximately 7 students that sit inside the fishbowl that will be discussing this prompt. The other students on the outside have very specific roles that they need to follow. But the people on the inside, it's pretty open-ended. You just want them to participate. There's one person who's the moderator, and they're really not supposed to be too involved. I don't want them to call on people, because the idea in this activity is to get people to self-select to participate. So everybody has an obligation to participate, and they know that going into it. So they have to find a way to get their turn. And if you've ever been involved in a conversation with somebody who monopolizes the conversation and doesn't let you get a word in edgewise, you know how difficult that can be when you know you have to get a turn in, but they keep talking and dominating the conversation. So we want to teach our students to look at body language and be able to read it. You know, when somebody leans forward, you know, you can tell that they're ready to participate. They want to get in. So those people who tend to dominate the conversation, they're taught to read other people's body language and learn that it's their time to give up their turn and sit back and let the others participate. So you can also give students sentence frames in this technique to teach them how to get their turn. Just like, oh, and on top of that, I would like to add, oh, interesting point, but I think, you know, so you can give them those kinds of sentence frames that they can use to help to jump in. This is a great strategy to get your shy speakers to participate because they know they have to. It's a small group. There's only 7, and you have a you don't set a time limit on it beforehand. You let the conversation die out naturally. So the moderator might prompt people to speak, but they really shouldn't comment and give feedback. They just want to help and encourage people to participate by looking at them and recognizing them and acknowledging them and inviting them non-verbally to come and participate in the conversation. So then you have the rest of the class on the outside of the fishbowl, and they're observing the conversation. And so we can assign roles to the people on the outside, because what happens when you don't assign roles? Then they might not pay attention. You know, they have to have a reason for listening. So let's give them a reason for listening. So we might have 1 or 2, it depends on how many students you have on the outside. You might have 1 or 2 people be the note taker and they're going to summarize what was said so far. You can have somebody keep time for how much time each person talks, because later we want to deconstruct this conversation and discuss it and analyze it. So we want to see who dominates the conversation and who spoke very little. Maybe they got their turn, which was their obligation to get in 1 turn, but perhaps they only spoke for 30 seconds, for example. And you might have 1 person who counts fillers. Fillers are a very bad language vice where people use words like, so, like, you know, to fill in the space. And what's the reason for fillers? Have you ever stopped to think about that? People use fillers to hold their turn, because if they stop talking, somebody else might jump in. So not only do we use fillers because maybe we're lacking vocabulary or clarity in our ideas, maybe it's just because we want to hold the ground. And it's very interesting because these nonverbal fillers like are very different depending on the student's mother tongue. So in French, they say, whereas in English, we say, in Spanish, they might say, when they want to ask a question, you know, so these nonverbal cues are different according to the languages that the people speak. But it's a bad habit, and we want to try and help our students to not have that bad habit. So when somebody counts and they tell you, oh, you said 10 times when in this instructional conversation, that helps you to become aware to not use those fillers. And I think that as teachers, as people who give presentations, we really want to avoid that. It's a bad habit. And so there's nothing like watching a recording of yourself speak to help cure yourself of that habit once and for all, because you'll realize how distracting it can be to the listeners when you say that over and over. So let's talk a little bit more about the prompt. The prompt is really important to make the instructional conversation work nicely. So as I mentioned, it's a little scenario, a little situation that you set up, and there's usually some kind of controversy in there that's going to encourage people to participate. One other thing that I forgot to mention that's really important is that the prompt needs to be very appropriate for the age and the background of your students. So I typically work with college students and people who are in teacher training. And so they're ready to be, they're in pre-service training or in-service training. So they're teachers. So I work with a lot of prompts that are relevant to teachers. But let's say you're working with a batch of 12-year-olds and you're teaching them English. So you should choose something that's relevant to them. So you might want to talk about soccer or homework or, you know, some situation that's pertinent to their lives, or your first girlfriend. Or with college students, I'll talk about life in the dorms or living in a new country, or going to the university for the first time in a new country, different topics like that. So it's very, very important that the prompt be pertinent to the participants in the instructional conversation in order for the conversation to evolve naturally and to be an interesting conversation. So here's an example of a prompt I came up with. I said, Trang Nguyen has a class of 40 students. Because of coronavirus, students are now suddenly in an online class. The teacher is not confident and she has never taught virtually before. This is her first time, but she's been thrown into it. So the moderator can kind of summarize like this and add some ideas. She's got the prompt or he's got the prompt, so you can explain a little bit too. The teacher is accustomed to students paying attention to lessons and usually earning very good grades. Students are finding online learning difficult and are failing. What does she do? Should she fail her students? So can you see how that would make an interesting conversation, right? She has a moral obligation to give them the grade that they deserve, but is it her fault that they're not doing well because she doesn't have the professional development or the tech tools, any of those topics that we generated in the previous activities? So I'm presenting these 3 activities as things that can be done in a row. You can do the brainstorming with the affinity mapping first, and then you can do the conversations with people talking in the corners. So you developed questions from the affinity mapping. And now we're going deeper into a deep conversation. So we've already generated vocabulary. We've already generated ideas. Students have had time to talk about all of this. So now they should have a very rich conversation about this topic. It would be much different if you just threw them into this straight away. So here's a prompt, sit and talk about it in pairs, which you could easily do, and maybe students would have a good conversation. But with this setup, students have the time to think about the ideas that they want to express and the vocabulary that they would like to use in order to express their ideas. So that wraps up what I have in terms of the strategies that I wanted to talk to you about. And I have a couple of questions for you that we can discuss in the chat if you would like. And I'm wondering, what is one thing you learned during this session? And maybe you know these strategies, maybe you've used them before, but is there a new twist on them? Can we think about the tech tools and how we might apply them in the online environment? And how can you incorporate it in your English language class? How can you incorporate these ideas? So let's move to the Q&A.
Thank you, Julie. Everyone, if you have any questions or if you want to share any thoughts on the topic, you can feel free to comment on the chat box and we will communicate your ideas to her. So this is time for questions. Khánh, have you received any questions from the audience?
Did you have any dialogue going on about the questions that we posed at the beginning? What were the attendees saying?
Yeah, that's good. I have some, actually I have some good questions from the audience that I want to share with you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I try to share my screen here. Yeah. Can you all see my screen?
I can.
Yeah, with the presentation mode, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So we have some questions now. So the first questions, I got a lot of questions from this one. Could you please share your slide with with us?
My pleasure. Absolutely. I'll send it to the presenters, and I'm not sure how, can I upload it to the site or shall I send it to you and you can share it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just send it to us and we can upload it on the website for people to download.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
So thank you, Dr. Ciancio, for a very wonderful presentation. Yeah, that gave us a lot of useful tips for teaching online, a lot of useful activities. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now we come to the second questions. How to adapt a conversation for lower level students?
That's a good question. With the lower level students, we might do what I mentioned where you have the groups go together so you don't have the one person who stays back to summarize, because summarizing is a higher order thinking skill that's more difficult. So we would probably keep the groups together. Rather than having them write a paragraph summary, you could just have them do it orally or have them just do bullet points and just put the main ideas. One thing that I forgot to mention was you can also have, when they're done with all of their bullet points, you can have the last group kind of circle the key words. And those are words that they can then use in the subsequent activity. So if you do the conversation in the fishbowl, so they already have the vocabulary. Of course, the topic that you choose is really important. So if you can choose easier topics that your students can manage, then that helps. And you might also want to use fewer stations. So maybe only 3 stations would be sufficient for more beginner or intermediate students. You can also use picture prompts. One of the roles that we can also give to people in the instructional conversation is that somebody could also draw pictures to represent the ideas that have been discussed in the instructional conversation. That's the fishbowl activity. So we could do the same kind of thing for the conversations, where you could have students draw a picture based on the question. So they might describe their picture. So you could use some nonverbals that would help too.
That's great. Thank you for your answers. And I have a second question from the audience. Oh, sorry, the third one from the audience, which is very interesting. So what will the future ELT curriculum look like?
Wow, that's a big question. That's really interesting. Yeah, for sure. I think that we're going to be moving more and more to online. I think that, coronavirus has been really bad for a lot of things, but it's actually been good for some things. I think that we've learned that we can slow down the pace of our life a little bit, that we can stay home with family, that we can cook instead of going out to restaurants all the time. And I think that the fact that online teaching had to suddenly become popular around the world overnight, it really did a big favor for online teaching. Because in a lot of countries, there was a lot of prejudice against online teaching in the past. They didn't think it was the same. They didn't think it could have the same effects. They thought that students had to be in the classroom to learn. And I think that we've learned in this very short time, in the last 4 months or so, that in fact, online teaching can be quite effective. And it really pushed us to develop new technology and new tools to be able to deal with online teaching. So Zoom jumped way up in terms of usage around the world. Their stock prices went way up. The stocks in companies like Sign Now, so everybody's doing things virtually now, is becoming so popular. So I think that, like, for example, in Zoom for online teaching, we can use the breakout rooms. And we can use the breakout rooms for all of the activities that I mentioned. So for the affinity mapping, you can always have your students go out into different breakout rooms, and they can actually do pair work and group work in the online environment, just like we would have our students do in the classroom. Some of the other platforms also have this available. Google is starting to develop it in Google Hangouts. They didn't have it before. So coronavirus is forcing the technology companies to kind of move quickly with moving forward with this kind of technology that we can use in the classroom. So I think that that's going to be the trend and the tendency, is that we'll see more and more online and more inclusion of technology tools, even if students are in the classroom. So now you can have students working on their cell phone when they're in class. I know that that's still controversial in a lot of places, that people don't want students on their phones in class, because this comes back again to the issue with classroom management. Classroom management in an online space is much more difficult than on ground. So how do you monitor? How do you know if students are playing around on their cell phone, if they're playing games or texting? How do you know when they're sitting in front of their laptop, if they're really paying attention when you're doing an online synchronous class? They could easily be on their phone and you couldn't even see it if it's down below. So I think that we need to improve our skills in classroom management to be more effective. And in order to do that, we have to keep the class very dynamic, very engaging, very interactive, because it's much easier for students to get bored online. It's one-on-one, they're alone. So if you don't have breakout rooms or some kind of dynamic like the affinity maps where students can collaborate on a Google Doc and move the ideas around, then it becomes difficult, and students might feel like they're in isolation. In the instructional conversation activity that I described last, we can do that in the online environment too, and we don't need breakout rooms. So if you don't use Zoom, if you use another platform, you can still do that instructional conversation in the online environment. where you assign the 7 people who are supposed to be in the middle, and you have them on panel view so you can see all of the students on your screen, and you assign who those 7 are inside the circle who need to speak. So they'll no longer be in a circle, they'll be in a grid view. But you can still assign the roles and still have the conversation. So that's what I think. I think we're going to be going more and more in the direction of technology and online teaching, and it's going to get better and better.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers. Now we have one more question from the audience. You have a lot of questions today.
Great, that's good. I'm so happy.
Well, the last question today, it's from Miss Tu Da. Well, I have a question. It's difficult in class management when we teach online and with affinity mapping and conversation activities. Are we trying to provide more scaffolding to learners when we teach online?
Absolutely, yes. I'm a huge fan of scaffolding. It's absolutely necessary in everything we do. So the activities that I described are generally more advanced activities, but we can always modify everything to be appropriate for beginners or intermediate students or young learners. We can always modify everything. So with the affinity mapping, that is scaffolding for the next step. Right? So affinity mapping is a type of brainstorming activity that helps people to start thinking about the topic, generating ideas. Remember that with brainstorming, we're never criticizing. We're never saying, no, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't fit here. With brainstorming, anything goes. We just want people to speak. We want them to feel comfortable. We want to drop the affective filter so that, you know, they don't feel afraid to contribute and converse and be part of the collaboration. So the affinity mapping is scaffolding for the conversation activity. So they've already generated those ideas. They've already started to think about the vocabulary. And then based on those 4 categories that they created, we then create the questions that we'll put into the different corners of the room. So with intermediate or advanced speakers, you can get the students to craft the question. So you saw the topics, like the topic was technology. And then the question became, how can I find out how to use technology tools in my classroom? So you can get them to develop the question. So that's scaffolding into the conversations aspect of it. So with the affinity mapping, they're just generating words. They're not really having a long discussion or conversation. So this is brainstorming and this is scaffolding for the next step. In the next step with the conversation, then they're actually getting into the conversation and agreeing and disagreeing and summarizing and writing down their ideas. So that's scaffolding for the next step, which would be the instructional conversation. And you don't need to do all 3 activities in one class. Maybe you're talking about a theme or a topic. So the theme I chose for these examples I gave you was the sudden shift to online teaching in the synchronous environment in today's world. And you could talk about any topic. Let's talk about, like I said, I work with college students, so I talk about dorm life. You know, so you could generate ideas about living in the dorms, pros and cons, issues that come up, and then create the conversations based on those ideas. And then you can do the fishbowl conversation again about that topic. So you could have a theme that you develop over several classes. If your class is only 50 minutes long, maybe you don't want to do all 3 of these in one day. So you could do one and then the next class, remember that topic that we did? So you need to save it somehow. If you use Flippity, you can save it and bring it into the next class because you'll need to remind students what you talked about. But scaffolding is very, very, very important. It really helps students to be successful. And we want our students to be successful and to enjoy their learning and to feel comfortable and confident to share and participate.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ciancio, very much for your wonderful presentation and helpful instructional activities for teachers. Yeah, and I hope that they can use, they can take away a lot of useful information after your talk. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to carrying on the conversation offline. So I'll be available in the chat. And if you have more questions, please send them to me there.